Hello friends, welcome to EduTap. In this particular video, we will be taking forward our discussion of components of budget. In the previous video, we have already looked at receipts. We have in detail analyzed revenue receipts, capital receipts, debt and non-debt creating capital receipts, as well as revenue receipts versus capital receipts, the distinction. Now we'll be looking at expenditure. We'll be looking at revenue and capital expenditure. We'll be looking at importance of capital expenditure and we'll be looking at the distinction between revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. So without further ado, let us take our discussion ahead. A lot of groundwork has been done. We have explained to you the meanings of the terms assets and liabilities. So many things are there which you are already comfortable with. We just need to sort of, extrapolate our understanding into government expenditure. We'll be looking at characteristics. We'll be looking at types. You know the drill now. That slowly and steadily we'll build up our ideas. And by the end of this lecture, you'll be completely thorough with your understanding of government expenditure. Government expenditure can be classified under two heads: revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. This is no different from government receipts. Government receipts are also divided into revenue receipts and capital receipts. Government expenditure has likewise been divided into revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Revenue expenditure is your ongoing operating expense. This is your day-to-day expenditure, monthly expenditure that the government has to undertake. One of the best examples that I can give to you for revenue expenditure is salary that the government pays to government employees. It is an ongoing operating expense forever. Since the start of the government till the end of the government, salaries are going to be paid out. Without salaries, without employees, government cannot function. It is an operating expense. On the other hand, capital expenditure, one-time large purchase, land, factory, port, highways. These are expenditures which can be considered to be your capital expenditure. So if I have purchased a highway, or for that matter, if I have spent on creation of a highway, or if I have spent on creation of a port, right? It is not as if that I'm creating a port or a highway every day, every month, every week, every year. No, that's not the case. Probably every 5 years or every 10 years, we are building one large capacity, right, to take care of our needs, right? So that is the kind of idea that you have to keep in mind. That this is the key distinction between revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Going ahead, we are going to elaborate further upon each of these components. Bear with me, just be patient with me, and we'll understand in very much in detail that what are various heads of revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. The point is that we were not always classifying our expenditure into revenue and capital expenditure categories. Earlier, we used to classify expenditure as developmental, non-developmental. Thereafter, the classification was changed, and we started classifying our expenditure under the heads of plan and non-plan expenditure. Again, the classification got changed, and we started classifying our expenditure under capital expenditure and revenue expenditure category. Now, what is the idea that you have to gather from this particular or these changes that have happened over a period of last 60, 70, 80 years? Now, the point is that what is the meaning of developmental expenditure or plan expenditure or capital expenditure? The idea that they're trying to encapsulate is broadly the same. The names have changed, the meanings have changed, but the broad idea, generally speaking, has not changed, right? So your developmental expenditure or a plan expenditure or a capital expenditure is that kind of expenditure which results in creation of some kind of a physical asset, right? Maybe a building, maybe a factory, maybe a school, maybe a hospital, maybe a dam, maybe some kind of an irrigation network, maybe ports, maybe airports, maybe some kind of research laboratories, maybe machines, tools, equipments, right? So these are the kind of expenditures which can help bring about the development of the country. Like for example, if we create schools and hospitals and all those things, right? And R&D laboratories and scientific infrastructure, so on and so forth, it can help bring about development. And the meaning of development, we have discussed this earlier, right? This was then we started referring to this as plan expenditure, because in every 5-year plan that the government of India made, right, up till the recent 5-year plan. So every 5-year plan that the government of India made, and do not worry, we have a separate chapter on planning itself, and we're going to discuss that also in great detail with you. So every 5-year plan that the government made, there were certain targets laid down. Okay, we want to make so many schools, so many hospitals, so many dispensaries, so many laboratories. We want to establish this factory here, that factory there. We want to establish this machinery here, that machinery there. We have to undertake modernization of this machinery, so on and so forth. So there used to be targets within a plan that, okay, we need to achieve this, we need to inaugurate these things. Okay, so that was referred to as plan expenditure. But what about the things which have already been created, right? So the schools that have been created, they need to be painted, they need to be repaired, right? So what about that kind of expenditure? So that was referred to as non-plan expenditure. So every expenditure that did not result in creation of an asset was referred to as, let us say, your non-plan expenditure. Are you getting my point? In the sense that this was like an ongoing sort of an expense. It was referred earlier to as a non-developmental expenditure. Now it is referred to as revenue expenditure, right? So we will elaborate further upon this. We will develop a further understanding of this classification of expenditure being classified as developmental, non-developmental, plan, non-plan, and capital revenue. Going ahead, we are going to do that further in this particular lecture itself. I request you to bear with me. But you have to keep this in mind. That developmental eventually became plan, plan eventually became capital, non-developmental eventually became non-plan, non-plan eventually became revenue. We will be discussing more about this going ahead. Let us take our discussion ahead, right? Which of the following is not an example of developmental expenditure? Now, let us further develop our ideas. Okay, grants to states, is it developmental or is it not developmental? We have to identify which is not an example of developmental expenditure. So, grant to states, developing infrastructure projects, defense expenditure, developing railways, none of the above, which is not an example of developmental expenditure. Now, there are certain things which are very clear over here. You may develop your own idea as to what the answer should be, but let me place some ideas in front of you using this concept check itself. Developing railways, that means we are creating some kind of a transportation network, right? It's some kind of an asset basically, right? The government can use this particular transportation network, right? And using this asset, government can sort of generate some fees, generate payment for itself, and this is something that the government owns. If the government so wishes, it can sell off the transportation network, or it will sell off the railway operations and the rails between Mumbai and Delhi. Let us say that government may sell off Mumbai railway line to me, that you operate forever henceforth. You just give me, let us say, 10 lakh crore rupees, let us assume, okay, and I give the government 10 lakh crore rupees, let us assume, and I run the Mumbai Delhi railway line forever. That is my line, right? So whatever amount of money that I generate using that will be my money. I'm giving a hypothetical example, but the point is that developing railways is a developmental expenditure. It results in creation of an asset. Developing infrastructure projects on similar lines is developmental expenditure because it results in creation of assets. Grants to states can also be classified under developmental expenditure because the money that is being given to the states can be used for creation of asset. On the other hand, your defense expenditure, particularly your salaries and pensions and so on and so forth, is not referred to as developmental expenditure because it doesn't really help in the development of the country. Like, I'm not saying that defense is not important. That is not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that defense expenditure directly does not result in creation of developmental infrastructure or creation of conditions which can help in the development, right? So to that extent, generally speaking, we classify defense expenditure as non-developmental expenditure. You can argue with me, you can debate with me that in the absence of security, in the absence of defense, nobody can have peace. If there is no peace, there can be no security. If there can be no security, there can be no safety. In the absence of security and safety, the quality of life will be very bad. To that extent, if quality of life is very bad, that means that development is not there, so defense will help in development. You can argue that, right? I'm not denying that, but the fact of the matter still remains that defense expenditure generally is not classified as your developmental expenditure. We will elaborate further upon this, we will talk further upon this, but the point that you need to keep in mind is that developmental expenditure is like your plan expenditure or capital expenditure or that kind of expenditure that results in creation of assets or that kind of an expenditure which results in creation of the ecosystem which can bring about the development of the country directly. That is what you need to keep in mind. Based upon this, let us take our discussion further and talk directly about revenue expenditure. Now, you know the drill that we will be looking at characteristics of revenue expenditure, we will be looking at examples of revenue expenditure. Whenever we talk about revenue expenditure, the first thing that we must keep in mind is that it is like an ongoing operating expense such as salary payment. That I have already mentioned once, I will not repeat it again. It is like that does not result into creation of physical or financial asset. If I'm paying salaries or pensions or subsidies or transfer payment, what physical asset is getting created? Which land is getting purchased? Which factory is getting established? Is it a loan that I have given? Because loan is a financial asset. I have explained it to you earlier and I am mentioning it very explicitly now. That loan given out by government of India to, let us say, government of Sri Lanka is a financial asset for government of India and is a financial liability of the government of Sri Lanka. Why? Because that is government of Sri Lanka, has to pay interest. And why is it a financial asset for the government? Because government of India will receive interest on that. So if the government is giving out salaries, pensions, transfer payments, right, does this result in creation of financial asset? Not at all. Okay, it is recurring in nature. That means that this expenditure has to be made again and again, every month, every year. So just like revenue receipts were recurring in nature, revenue expenditure is also recurring in nature. Revenue expenditure was earlier referred to as non-developmental or non-plan expenditure. This is what you need to keep in mind. Let us look at some very clear-cut examples of revenue expenditure: salaries, pensions, interest payment, subsidy payment, defense expenditure, postal deficit, law and order expense, social service expenses, grants. These are all examples of revenue expenditure, and I can link each and every example back to the characteristic and prove it to you that they are revenue expenditure. Salaries, pensions, these are operating expenses. They have to be paid out every month because they have to be paid out because these are commitments. If you employ somebody, you have made a commitment that you will pay them a salary. If some employee has retired and you have committed that you are going to pay pension to them, then you have committed that you will pay pension to them. There is no choice of not paying that. If you have taken a loan from, let us say, international, some kind of, you have taken loan from IMF, let us say government of India, you have taken loan from IMF, you have committed to pay interest, you have to pay interest, you are using that loan amount, for your day-to-day needs or for whatever. But the fact of the matter remains that you have to pay that interest, and by paying that interest, it is not as if that you are creating asset. By paying interest to IMF, what land are you purchasing? By paying interest to IMF, what financial asset are you creating? Nothing. If you are paying subsidies to farmers, okay, so it is like an ongoing operating expense that you have to pay every month, probably every year. You have to keep paying until and unless you abolish the subsidies altogether, which is like an extremely impossible thing to do in a country like India. Abolishing of subsidies is a very unpopular move. Therefore, no government will probably want to abolish subsidies, right? If the government is giving out, let us say, fertilizer subsidy to farmers, what land is the government purchasing, or what financial asset is getting created? Nothing is getting created. Defense expenditure, that particularly the salaries and pensions that are getting paid out, right? Can we afford to not pay? Can we have a single month where we are not paying our soldiers? Is that ethically, morally, socially, economically, politically correct? Not at all. So this is again recurring in nature, right? It doesn't result in creation of physical or financial asset, and it is an operating expense, ongoing expense, and more importantly, it is a committed expenditure. We have committed that we are going to pay this expenditure. It is next to impossible to reduce this kind of an expenditure. Postal deficit, if you're sending a post and you're paying 5 rupees or 7 rupees or 10 rupees for that post, and if you're couriering that same envelope from, let us say, point A to point B, and if you're paying 30 rupees or 35 rupees, so to post you're paying, let us say, 10 rupees. I'm giving you a hypothetical example, right? Or you're not paying at all, okay, and if you are sending it, let us say, by courier, okay, and you're paying 30 rupees or 40 rupees, so the difference between what you're paying to the post and what you're paying to the courier company, how is that difference there, and why is that difference there? Government is offering you postal services at extremely subsidized rates. Are you getting my point? And to that extent, you're able to send out posts at cheaper rates. So government is encouraging communication. Now this was all old-fashioned things, but the theory is still there, right? It is not vanished. Are you getting my point? So the subsidy that you get indirectly through postal services is also referred to as revenue expenditure because it is ongoing, operating. It doesn't. So if the government is giving me postal subsidy in the sense that my letter sending charges should have been 30, but actually it is only 10. Matlab 20 rupees is being paid by the government. So what asset got created because of that expenditure? Nothing, right? It is an ongoing sort of an expense, recurring sort of an expense, right? If you look at law and order expenditure, right? If the government is paying salary to, let us say, police or your central armed police forces, so on and so forth, right? These are ongoing operating expenses and they do not result in the creation of any physical asset. Yeah, I may be using CISF to protect a physical asset. Let us say that I am using CISF to protect some kind of a nuclear establishment. Now that nuclear establishment is a physical asset, okay? But the money that I'm spending on protecting it, that is not your capital expenditure, that is your revenue expenditure, because just because I'm protecting it doesn't mean I'm creating it. your social service expenditure, like for example those asha workers, right, those health workers who go from door to door administering vaccines. Okay, so that is like an ongoing sort of an exercise. You cannot stop universal vaccination program, you have to keep it ongoing. If you are running a universal vaccination program, obviously you have to pay people who are involved in that program, whatever you may be paying them, high or low, that doesn't matter, but I'm sure you must be paying something to them, right? And it doesn't result in creation of physical or financial assets, right? So running these kind of social service programs or giving grants, let us say that some kind of a natural disaster has taken place or occurred in some kind of a neighboring country, right, and the government of India offers, let us say, 200 crore rupees as grant. Okay, so that is like, it doesn't result into creation of physical or financial asset in India, right? And generally speaking, I'm not saying that way, but generally speaking, you will see that some disaster or something bad is happening at some point or the other, and government of India keeps giving out grants, right? But okay, cyclone has struck somewhere, grant; earthquake has struck somewhere, grant; some kind of accident has happened somewhere, grant, right? I'm not making a joke out of it, but what I'm trying to say to you is that this is a kind of expenditure which doesn't result into creation of physical or financial asset in India, right? And typically it is happening like, it is a recurring phenomena kind of a thing. Are you getting my point? To that extent, this grant also gets classified as revenue expenditure. One of the most important touchstone, one of the most important measures that you should always adopt is that you must see whether the expenditure that you are undertaking results in the creation of physical or financial assets or not. So if it does, then it is capital expenditure, and if it does not, then it is a revenue expenditure. Always you must ask yourself only this one particular question, that this expenditure, is it resulting into directly, okay? No indirect, this acha aisa ho jayega to waisa ho jayega, this happens, then this will happen, then this will happen. No, directly. If expenditure results in direct creation of physical financial asset, great, it is capital expenditure, otherwise it is revenue expenditure, right? I have placed a simple concept check in front of you. Which of the items given below forms a part of revenue expenditure? Salaries, pensions, provident fund paid by government, grants given by government to Indian states and foreign countries, subsidies forwarded to all sectors, law and order expenditure. Which of this is your revenue expenditure, right? So I'm sure that you have identified over here that the answer to this question should be E, that is all of the above, because all these expenses, right, that the government is undertaking, these are regular expenses, operating expenses, recurring expenses, do not result into creation of any kind of financial or physical asset, right? And they can also be classified as your non-developmental expenditure, right? Because these expenditures are not really helping out bring about development. When you create some kind of a facility which brings about the conditions for development, that gets classified as developmental expenditure. It is an ongoing exercise. Development, we are understanding all of these things gradually. So the answer to this question is E. If I have to take the discussion ahead and talk about capital expenditure, I have already emphasized while discussing revenue expenditure that your revenue expenditure does not result into creation of physical or financial assets, whereas capital expenditure is like your one-time large purchase of a physical asset. It does result into creation of physical or financial assets or reduction of liabilities. Either which ways is referred to as a capital expenditure. I'll be giving you adequate examples to make my point clearer. This is non-recurring in nature. There is no fixed frequency. It is not as if that it is happening every month, every year. It is not like that. It may happen, it may not happen, right? You may purchase land this year, you may not purchase land for next 5 years, right? So that is the kind of idea that you need to keep in mind. It is also referred to as developmental or plan expenditure. And what are the examples of capital expenditure? Your loan disbursal, okay? So if the loan, government of India gives out a loan, okay, to government of Sri Lanka, that is an example of capital expenditure, okay? By capital expenditure, you create a financial asset, is what I'm trying to say. And this is what you need to keep in mind. By capital expenditure, you create a financial asset. So you have given a loan to government of Sri Lanka, your government of India, I'm government of Sri Lanka, you have given me loan. You have created a financial asset. Why and how? This is a financial asset for you. The loan that is mine, it's a financial liability for me, and it's a financial asset for you. Why is it a financial asset for you? Because you're going to earn interest on it, and that interest is revenue receipt, right? I hope that this is clear. Loan repayment is also referred to as capital expenditure. Any kind of loan repayment, any kind of payment, that means any kind of expenditure should be expenditure. And what is expenditure? Any kind of outgoing funds, outgoing money outgoing is expenditure. Now loan repayment is outgoing, right? So what can it be? Can it be revenue or can it be capital? You have to classify every incoming thing is either revenue or capital. There cannot be overlap. We cannot say that this is also revenue and also capital. So you have to be very clear in your understanding. Anything which is outgoing has to be either capital or revenue. Now loan repayment, and why is it capital expenditure? We look at this line, reduction of liabilities, okay? You have, this is the most important box, okay? And you have to focus upon this box more than any other box, okay? You look at this box, we have read or we have said over here that reduction of liability occurs because of capital expenditure. Now let us say that I am IMF and you are government of India and I had given you 1000 crore loan, right? That is a financial liability of yours. I am IMF and I have given you 1000 crore rupees loan. That is a financial liability of yours and you need to repay that money to me, right? So if you are repaying that loan to me, that is referred to as capital expenditure, and because of the loan repayment, your liability reduces. So let us say that you have taken cumulatively a loan of 10,000 crore from various parties. Out of that 1000 crore is something that I have given to you. I am IMF, your government of India, and you repay that loan to me. That means you have repaid that 1000 crore back to me. That means that now your liability, which was earlier standing at 10,000 CR, is now standing at 9,000 CR. That is what you need to keep in mind. That capital expenditure will either result in creation of financial assets or reduction of liabilities, okay? Capital expenditure is also referred to as plan expenditure. Capital expenditure is like capex on defense. So if you are buying fighter jets, if you are buying boats, if you are buying guns and all of those things, right? So if you are buying any kind of these machinery or tool or equipment, that is referred to as capital expenditure. So within defense expenditure, there are two categories of expenditure. Defense expenditure, which is undertaken on salaries and pensions and all of these things, like, you know, canteen and all these things. This is your operating expense. This is your revenue expenditure. But the expenditure that you are undertaking as a capital expenditure, that means expenditure on tools and equipments, on machinery that the army is using, including the arms and armaments, that will be referred to as your capital expenditure. Capital expenditure on general service, example railways. Like for example, government purchases new coaches, new engines, new lines are being made, right? Or the lines are being electrified, so on and so forth. So that kind of expenditure is your capital expenditure. The salary of motorman, okay, the salary of railway staff, that is revenue expenditure. But creation of that infrastructure is capital expenditure. That is something that you should keep in mind. Repayment of other liabilities like pension funds. Like for example, employee and government have both contributed some amount of money towards pension, and that amount of money gets repaid, or the government pays out that pension after 30 years, something like that. So that pension is also a liability, right? Government has to repay that. So any kind of repayment, okay, any kind of loan that was borrowed is now being repaid, will be referred to as your capital expenditure. Expenditure on purchase of land, building, machinery, etc. is also your capital expenditure. This is one of the first things that I had mentioned. Okay, so the idea is that you have outgoing funds from the government treasury. So either that outgoing fund will be revenue expenditure or capital expenditure. Which fund or which outgoing fund will be referred to as revenue expenditure? If your outgoing expenditure does not result in creation of asset or reduction of liability, then that is your revenue expenditure. If your outgoing expenditure causes a creation of asset or reduction of liability, then that is your capital expenditure. You have to keep this much in your mind. It is similar to what we had read or discussed while talking about revenue receipt and capital receipt. Revenue receipt does not change the position of asset liability. On the other hand, capital receipt either creates a liability or reduces the asset, is what we have established. Okay, so revenue expenditure does not change asset liability, revenue receipt does not change asset liability, capital receipt changes asset liability. Similarly, revenue expenditure does not change asset liability, but capital expenditure changes asset liability. That is what you need to keep in mind, right? So capital receipt creates liability or reduces asset, capital expenditure reduces liability, right, or creates asset. It is a flip side. I will repeat it only once for your benefit. We have written over here that capital expenditure result in creation of asset or reduction of liability, and capital receipt on the other hand reduces asset and creates liability. So it's the flip side. So if you have taken a loan, that is a capital receipt. If you're repaying that loan, that is a capital expenditure, right? If you have purchased a land, that is capital expenditure. If you're selling that land, that is capital receipt. It's a flip side, right? What is the importance of capital expenditure? Importance of capital expenditure is that it leads to creation of infrastructure, it leads to creation of productive capacities, plus it is the basis of enhanced production in future. Any kind of factory that is being established, any kind of transportation network that is established is helping increase the productive capacities of the economy. You know what is the meaning of productive capacities of the economy? We should be able to produce in our economy. We should be able to produce final goods and services in our economy, right? And generally speaking, your capital expenditure creates the infrastructure that is required to increase the productive capacities, and that is the importance of capital expenditure. If you don't establish sail, hail, if you don't establish dams, if you don't establish railway lines and road networks and port networks and airport networks, how do you exactly plan to, sort of carry out the production process? Because, to carry out the production process, not only do you have to establish the production facility, but you also have to establish connectivity between the production facility and the consumption centers. So everything that is being done on this count is very, very important, to increase the productive capacities of the economy. This is what you need to keep in mind. This is the importance of capital expenditure. Now, one thing that I would like to emphasize over here is that every government is spending. It's not a big deal that the government is spending, but what is the government spending on? That is important. If the government is spending a lot of money on capital expenditure, that is good, that is very good, that is desirable, that is excellent, that is extremely good. But if the government is reducing capital expenditure, is not making adequate capital expenditure, rather government is making a lot of revenue expenditure, okay, that is bad, that is very bad, that is undesirable, that is quite wasteful, right? Which is not to say that revenue expenditure is not important. You have to pay out salaries, pensions, interest. I'm not denying that, right? But you cannot sacrifice capital expenditure, because if you're sacrificing capital expenditure, you're not making the base for production. You're not enhancing the base for production. You're not enhancing the ecosystem that can help improve productivity. So I hope that this idea is clear to you, that out of the two expenditures, both are important, right? No doubt that revenue expenditure is also important, but we need to keep the discipline so far as revenue expenditure is concerned. We cannot keep spending on things which do not result into creation of assets. We have to emphasize upon capital expenditure, because that results in creation of assets, that results in creation of productive capacities. So whenever we are looking at government expenditure, we must see whether capital expenditure is increasing. If it is increasing, we are on the right track. If it is not, there is a problem. This is the idea that you need to keep in mind. I have placed a simple concept check in front of you. Which among the following is not one of the features of capital expenditure? Not one of the features. Non-recurring in nature. Okay, so you just look at the features again. This is one time large purchase of assets results in creation of physical financial assets, reduction of liabilities. This is non-recurring in nature, right? And it can be referred to as developmental or plan expenditure. So this is non-recurring in nature. It leads to creation of assets. It can also be referred to as developmental. It can result in the creation of productive capacities in an economy. So इसमें से कौन सा feature नहीं है? Which of the following is not one of the features? This is what you need to decide. The answer to this question is E, because all of the above are features of capital expenditure. I hope that this is clear to you. Moving ahead, let us see the distinction between revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Very quickly, we'll be placing everything that we have learned on one screen itself, right? Revenue expenditure does not lead to creation of physical financial asset. This one leads to creation of physical financial assets. Effect is temporary. If you're paying a salary, I'll work for you for 1 month. Don't pay me my salary next month, I'll stop working for you. Effect is long term. If you have purchased land, it is forever yours. It is not going to go away. It is recurring and regular. It does not recur again and again, right? Your interest payments on loan, grants, subsidies, salaries, pensions, right? Whether it be civilian or defense, guys, right? That is the kind of revenue expenditure. on the other hand, acquisition of land, building, machinery, equipment, investment in shares, right? Loans and advances given, right? Acquisition of capital and machinery, including defense purposes wala machinery. These are all examples of your capital expenditure. Everything that we have discussed so far has been summarized in this distinction slide, and I hope that this is clear to you. Based upon this, I have placed a concept check question in front of you. Which among the following is not one of the features of revenue expenditure? Again, we are asking you which of the following is not one. इसमें से कौन सा feature नहीं है revenue expenditure का? It is also referred to as consumptive expenditure. Now see, here is where you have to apply your mind. We have called capital expenditure as productive expenditure. Now there is something called as consumptive expenditure. Okay, so what do you think is a consumptive expenditure? Revenue expenditure or capital expenditure? You have to decide. Apply your logic. It helps in the day-to-day functioning of an organization. It can often be in the form of committed expenditure. Now I had repeated this word committed expenditure probably 10 times. You need to decide whether revenue expenditure is committed expenditure or not. It was earlier referred to as non-plan expenditure. None of the above. So which of the following is not one of the features of revenue expenditure? The answer should be E. Why? Because all of these are features of revenue expenditure. This is consumption expenditure. When you consume, even if I look at a household level and you are purchasing clothes and shoes and toys and TV, that is consumption. So it's not as if you're establishing a factory. It's not as if you're establishing, you're purchasing land. It's not as if you're purchasing shares. So that is consumption expenditure. Okay, you're just consuming. You're not creating assets. Okay, so revenue expenditure that the government undertakes is also referred to as your consumptive expenditure because it doesn't result in creation of any asset, right? So if the government is paying out salaries or purchasing ink, chair, furniture for offices and all of these things, these are consumptive expenditure, which is helpful for the day-to-day functioning of the organization. It is committed expenditure. You cannot stop paying this expenditure out. You have to keep paying this expenditure out. And as discussed earlier, this is referred to as non-developmental and non-plan. We have started calling it revenue expenditure, right? So that is the key change that we have made, and therefore the answer to this question becomes E, and that is the right answer. I hope that you have very clearly understood the distinction between revenue and capital expenditure, the characteristics and types of revenue and capital expenditure. You need to revise, and once that is done, everything will be there in your head for a longish period of time and will be very helpful in your examinations. With this, we'll bring our lecture to an end. Thank you very much for your patience. All the very best. Jai Hind.